The spring of 874 marked the beginning of Erik's campaign into Mercia, the last great Saxon kingdom in the Midlands. The winter had passed and his army had grown even stronger. New recruits from Northumbria had been integrated into the force, bringing the total number of warriors to over 4,000. They were no longer just a raiding party. They were a conquering army, disciplined, well-supplied, and led by a man who understood the art of war in a way that few in England could comprehend. King Burgred of Mercia received the news of Erik's advance with a mixture of dread and defiance. He had heard the stories of what had happened in Northumbria, of the swift fall of York, of the way that Erik had transformed a military conquest into a functioning kingdom. But Burgred was a proud man, a man who had ruled Mercia for decades, and he was not about to surrender his kingdom without a fight. He sent out a call to arms, summoning his nobles and his warriors, preparing to make a stand against the Viking invaders. The first major engagement came at the town of Nottingham, a strategic stronghold that controlled the crossing of the Trent River. The Mercian forces, numbering perhaps 2,000 strong, had fortified the town and prepared to defend it. They expected a frontal assault, a direct attack on the walls, the kind of siege warfare that had characterized many of the Viking campaigns of the past. But Erik had learned from history. He did not attack the town directly. Instead, he moved his army around it, cutting off its supply lines, isolating it from the rest of Mercia. For weeks, the two armies faced off across the open fields surrounding Nottingham. The Mercians, confident in their fortifications, waited for the Vikings to attack, but the attack never came. Instead, Erik's forces grew stronger, swollen by new recruits from the surrounding countryside, men who had decided that the future belonged to the Vikings, not to the aging King Burgred. The Mercian garrison, watching from the walls, began to understand that they were not facing a siege in the traditional sense. They were facing a slow, inexorable pressure, a gradual tightening of the noose. And then, one night, the gates of Nottingham opened. Not because the Vikings had broken through, but because the commander of the garrison, a man named Aelred, who had grown tired of the endless waiting, had negotiated a surrender. He had seen the writing on the wall. He had understood that resistance was futile. He had decided to save his men and himself by yielding to the inevitable. The town of Nottingham fell without a final, desperate battle. It fell because the will to resist had been broken, not by the clash of swords, but by the patient, inexorable pressure of Erik's strategy. With Nottingham secured, Erik established it as a fortified stronghold, a base of operations for the next phase of his campaign. He appointed a garrison, established a system of governance, and began the process of integrating the town into his growing Viking kingdom. And then, he turned his attention to the next target. Lincoln, another major Mercian stronghold, another key to the control of the Midlands. The pattern that had worked at Nottingham was repeated at Lincoln. Erik's army surrounded the town, cut off its supply lines, and waited. The Mercian garrison, watching the Vikings grow stronger day by day, began to lose hope. The commander of the garrison, a man named Oswin, sent desperate messages to King Burgred, pleading for reinforcements, for relief, for some sign that help was coming. But the messages that came back were evasive, non-committal. Burgred was gathering his forces. Burgred was preparing a counterattack, but the relief never came. After 3 weeks of siege, the gates of Lincoln opened. Again, not because the Vikings had broken through, but because the garrison had decided that surrender was preferable to starvation. The town fell, and with it, the heart of Mercian resistance began to crumble. Erik's strategy was not based on the clash of armies, but on the slow, patient erosion of the enemy's will to resist. It was a strategy that was far more effective than any frontal assault could have been. But Erik's strategy was not just about military conquest. He understood that holding territory required more than just the presence of soldiers. It required the cooperation of the local population, the establishment of a functioning economy, the creation of a sense of order and stability. As his army advanced through Mercia, he established a system of governance that was designed to win the hearts and minds of the people. He appointed local leaders to positions of authority, men who had proven their willingness to cooperate with the new Viking regime. He established markets where merchants could trade freely. He encouraged craftspeople to establish themselves in the newly conquered towns. He promoted the building of new settlements, the expansion of agriculture, the development of trade routes. He also made strategic decisions about how to treat the conquered population. He did not engage in the wholesale slaughter that some Viking leaders had been known to perpetrate. Instead, he offered the people a choice. Accept Viking rule, and you will be treated fairly and allowed to continue your lives. Resist, and you will be destroyed. Most chose to accept. They had seen what resistance had cost Oswulf in Northumbria. They had seen the power of Erik's army. They understood that resistance was futile. Erik's campaign in Mercia was a masterclass in strategy and logistics. He did not just move his army from place to place, attacking fortified towns and hoping for the best. Instead, he carefully planned each move, ensuring that his supply lines were secure, that his forces were well fed and well supplied, that he always maintained the initiative. He used his knowledge of the land gathered by his scouts to outmaneuver the Mercian forces. He struck where they were weak. He avoided them where they were strong. He was a chess player, and the kingdom of Mercia was his board. One of his most brilliant moves was the establishment of a fortified line of strongholds across Mercia, a series of towns and fortresses that were connected by roads and supply lines. These strongholds served multiple purposes. They were military bases from which he could launch attacks on remaining Mercian forces. They were administrative centers from which he could govern the conquered territory. They were trading posts where merchants could exchange goods. They were symbols of Viking power and permanence. They sent a message to the people of Mercia. The Vikings are here to stay. Resistance is futile. Cooperation is the path to prosperity. The people of Mercia, watching this new kind of Viking army, began to understand that they were facing something different from the raiding parties that had plagued their kingdom in the past. The Vikings did not burn and pillage indiscriminately. They did not slaughter the innocent. Instead, they offered a choice: accept Viking rule and prosper, resist and be destroyed. Most chose to accept. They had seen what happened to those who resisted. They understood that the future belonged to the Vikings, not to the aging King Burgred. As the months passed and the Viking conquest of Mercia became more complete, King Burgred found himself increasingly isolated. His kingdom was crumbling around him. His nobles were either dead, captured, or had switched their allegiance to Erik. His people were accepting Viking rule. He had become a king without a kingdom, a leader without followers. In the end, he did what many defeated kings did. He fled. He gathered what remained of his loyal followers and made his way south towards Wessex, hoping to find refuge with his brother-in-law, King Ethelred. He retreated south towards the kingdom of Wessex, the last remaining bastion of Anglo-Saxon power. He sent desperate pleas for help to King Ethelred of Wessex, the brother of the great Alfred. He warned him that the Vikings were not just a threat to Mercia, but to all of England. He told him that if they did not stand together, they would fall together. But Ethelred was a cautious man, a man who was more concerned with protecting his own borders than with saving a rival kingdom. He sent a small force to help Burgred, a token gesture of support. But it was not enough. Erik's army continued its advance, a relentless tide that seemed to swallow everything in its path. They took the great Mercian towns of Nottingham and Lincoln, turning them into fortified Viking strongholds. They established a new border, a new frontier, a new reality. The kingdom of Mercia, which had once been a proud and powerful nation, was now a broken, divided land. The ground was lost. The world was changing. The conquest of Mercia took several months, a campaign that was marked by careful planning, strategic brilliance, and a level of discipline that was unprecedented in Viking warfare. Erik's forces moved through the kingdom like a well-oiled machine, each unit knowing its role, each commander understanding the overall strategy. There was no random plunder, no unnecessary destruction. Every action was calculated, every move was part of a larger plan. By the end of the campaign, Erik had established a new Viking kingdom in Mercia, a kingdom that was not just a military conquest, but a functioning state with laws, governance, and economic systems. He had appointed administrators, established courts, created a system of taxation that was fair and predictable. He had encouraged trade, promoted the building of new settlements, invested in the infrastructure that would allow Mercia to prosper under Viking rule. The transformation of Mercia under Viking rule was remarkable. The kingdom, which had been torn apart by internal conflict and weakened by the Viking invasions, began to stabilize and prosper. Trade routes were established, connecting Mercia with the Viking settlements in Northumbria and with the wider Viking world. New settlements were built, new farms were established, new markets were created. The people of Mercia, who had initially feared the Vikings, began to see them as potential partners in a new kind of society, a society where different peoples could live together, where commerce could flourish, where a new culture could be born. And as Mercia fell under Viking control, the last remaining independent Saxon kingdoms began to realize the magnitude of the threat they faced. The age of Viking raids was over. The age of Viking conquest had begun. And at the heart of this new age was a single man, a leader who had learned from his failures, who had adapted to a changing world, who had created a new kind of Viking power that was more dangerous and more effective than anything that had come before. His name was Erik Bjornsson, and he was about to challenge the very foundations of Saxon England. The stage was set for the final confrontation, the battle that would determine the fate of England itself. The strategic brilliance of Erik's campaign in Mercia became evident as the months passed. He did not just move his army from place to place, attacking fortified towns and hoping for the best. Instead, he carefully planned each move, ensuring that his supply lines were secure, that his forces were well fed and well supplied, that he always maintained the initiative. He used his knowledge of the land, gathered by his scouts, to outmaneuver the Mercian forces. He struck where they were weak. He avoided them where they were strong. He was a chess player, and the kingdom of Mercia was his board. The integration of Mercian warriors into Erik's army was another key to his success. Many Mercian soldiers, seeing the writing on the wall, chose to switch their allegiance to Erik rather than continue fighting for a losing cause. Erik welcomed these warriors, integrating them into his army, giving them positions of authority and responsibility. This not only increased his military strength, but also helped to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the Mercian population. If Mercian warriors were willing to fight for Erik, then perhaps Erik was not just a foreign conqueror, but a legitimate ruler. The economic integration of Mercia into Erik's Viking kingdom was equally important. Erik established new trade routes, connecting Mercia with the Viking settlements in Northumbria and with the wider Viking world. He encouraged merchants to establish themselves in the newly conquered towns. He promoted the building of new settlements, the expansion of agriculture, the development of new markets. The wealth generated by this economic activity enriched not just the Viking elite, but the entire population of Mercia. Slowly, the people of Mercia began to see the benefits of Viking rule, began to understand that they had a stake in the success of Erik's kingdom. By the end of the campaign, Erik had not just conquered Mercia. He had transformed it. He had taken a kingdom that was fragmented and weakened, and he had turned it into a prosperous, well-governed state. He had shown that Vikings were not just warriors, but could be administrators, strategists, builders. He had created a new kind of Viking kingdom, one that was based not just on military might, but on economic prosperity and good governance. The political implications of Erik's conquest of Mercia were enormous. With the fall of Mercia, the last major Saxon kingdom remaining in England was Wessex. The conquest of Mercia had demonstrated that Erik was not just a military leader, but a true king, a man capable of building and governing a kingdom. The news of Erik's success spread throughout Europe, inspiring other Viking leaders to attempt similar conquests. But none of them had Erik's vision. None of them had his strategic brilliance. None of them had his understanding of how to transform military victory into lasting political power. The military innovations that Erik introduced during the Mercian campaign would influence Viking warfare for generations to come. He had demonstrated that a disciplined, well-organized army could defeat larger forces through superior strategy and tactics. He had shown that patience and persistence could be more effective than frontal assaults. He had proven that a leader who understood the importance of supply lines, of logistics, of maintaining the morale of his troops, could achieve victories that seemed impossible. These lessons would be studied and emulated by Viking commanders throughout the medieval world. The economic transformation of Mercia under Viking rule was equally significant. The kingdom, which had been economically stagnant under Saxon rule, began to prosper under Viking administration. New trade routes were established, connecting Mercia with Northumbria and with the wider Viking world. New settlements were built, new farms were established, new markets were created. The wealth generated by this economic activity enriched not just the Viking elite, but the entire population of Mercia. Slowly, the people of Mercia began to see the benefits of Viking rule, began to understand that they had a stake in the success of Erik's kingdom. By the summer of 875 AD, Erik had consolidated his control over both Northumbria and Mercia. His kingdom stretched from the north of England to the Midlands, encompassing an area of vast wealth and strategic importance. His capital was York, his army numbered over 5,000 strong, and his vision of a new kind of Viking civilization seemed within reach. But there remained one final obstacle, one kingdom that had not yet bowed to his will: Wessex, the last remaining bastion of Saxon power in England. The final preparations for the invasion of Wessex were made in the spring of 878. Erik gathered his commanders, his generals, his most trusted advisors. He laid out his strategy, his vision for the campaign. He explained how he intended to defeat the Saxon forces, how he would consolidate his control over Wessex, how he would establish a new Viking kingdom that would encompass the entire island of England. His commanders listened with a mixture of awe and apprehension. They knew that what Erik was attempting was unprecedented, that the odds were against him, but they also knew that if anyone could succeed, it was Erik Bjornsson. The army that marched south from Mercia in the summer of 878 AD was the largest and most formidable force ever assembled by a Viking leader. It numbered over 5,000 strong, warriors from Scandinavia, from Northumbria, from Mercia, from Ireland. They were disciplined, well-trained, well-equipped. They were led by a man who had proven himself to be not just a warrior, but a true leader, a man with a vision for the future. They were marching to change the world, to establish a new order, to create a new kind of Viking kingdom that would last for generations.